Hello, my name is Jacob Ransom. Welcome to my lecture recital. I'm going to be presenting on the use of Ableton Live to learn, practice, and perform electroacoustic drum set works. This presentation is going to be broken down into three parts: the introduction and the objectives, how Ableton Live can be used to practice and perform works, and finally, an analysis and performance of selected works. Please write questions on the comment section if you're watching online, and start the comment with the word question. And then I'm going to try to answer those questions after the performances. I'm going to start with in-person questions and then move to online questions. So write them as the questions come up. As a reminder, there are technical terms on my program notes, which can be found on the Fred Fox School of Music website, but I will also try to explain things as I go. In the first section, I will explain the purpose of my research, the selection of pieces, the use of Ableton Live, and finally, a literature review. Because the influx of electroacoustic music, many pieces which are for percussion, there is a need for a more efficient process of learning and rehearsing these types of works as a performer. I will address the following fundamentals: starting and stopping electronic tracks, equalizing sound, miking acoustic instruments, running multiple sound sources, and adjusting levels, and routing audio. This presentation will look at the following electroacoustic composition types: fixed media, which is an electronic track that doesn't change. Fixed meaning non-changing, and media being sound. Live processing, which is the live processing of acoustic sound made by the performer, or the processing of electronic sound by the performer. So it's something happening live in the composition. Triggering, which uses a MIDI controller to change or advance sections, parts of a piece, or trigger specific sounds within a piece. Looping, which is a form of live processing based on recording audio, which then repeats, forming a loop. With the use of Ableton Live, I will show the learning applications that will help any performer rehearse and play electroacoustic music. I will present 4 compositions today. These works were chosen due to the different nature of the electronics, the variety of composition style, notation method, and learning process. There will be a small change in the program. Woven will be performed last to facilitate setting up with one more performer on stage. You ask, why Ableton? Ableton can perform the job of many in one program. The original intent for Ableton Live was to use a computer as a performing instrument with a graphic interface for live sound processing. The program is very easy to use, and because it's an industry standard, it's very reliable. You can drag and drop any type of audio into Ableton, then have the ability to edit, cut up that audio. There are instruments and effects built into the program, which can make it a great composing tool, and all the tools are compatible with MIDI controllers. Lastly, it works well with other live processing programs, such as Max MSP. Now, my literature review. First, Benjamin Reimer, defining the role of drum set performance in contemporary music. This was his dissertation. He breaks down drum set composition into 4 different categories. The tourist. This method describes the earliest approach to drum set composition, which were created by assimilating existing drum set techniques and instruments into a composer's style to create something new and exotic. A good example of this is Création du Monde by Milhaud, which uses jazz influence for an exotic sound. Second, the snapshot. This approach refers to the repertoire that captures or imitates an existing popular music or performance style. A good example of this is Bonham by Christopher Rouse, which uses the classic rock band Led Zeppelin as an influence, and their drummer, John Bonham. The non-idiomatic. This model for drum set composition defies what has been considered as appropriate by applying contemporary music complexity that results in highly uncharacteristic performance styles. A good example of this is James Dillon's Tire Tika Da, which uses Indian influence but is entirely contemporary. Also, another example would be in our percussion chamber music is ionization, which uses Latin instruments in a non-idiomatic way. Lastly, the confluent. This final approach is used to signify the flowing together of new and individualized compositional ideas with a rich history of drum set styles, techniques, and performance practices, also including the mixing of the previously mentioned works. So the pieces that I'm playing today fit in this last confluent category. My next source, the Cambridge Companion to Percussion, an article by Jeff Packman. He writes about drumming and technology, specifically the method in which percussionists play a drum set and the inseparable nature of drum set and multiple types of technology. This also speaks toward the changing of the instrument and hints that electronics will continue to be used increasingly with the drum set. Next, we have Christian Ann Osberger. She discusses the process of composing new electroacoustic percussion works with Ableton Live in her dissertation, Transients, an album-length recording for solo percussion electronics. She provides general history of electroacoustic music compositions, as well as the process of using Ableton Live for composing new works. She covers many of the common electroacoustic techniques for composition, such as fixed media and live processing. She also brings up another pertinent subject, writing that two compositional methods for electroacoustic works exist. So one where the music is composed by a composer and performed by a performer. The second category is where the performer is also the composer. So these methods have different implications for the composition style and performance of the electroacoustic music. And in my lecture recital, I'm going to play different works that are composed by the performer, and then ones that are composed by composers for performers. Thomas Brett, in his essay Virtual Drumming, provides a really nice overview of how technology combined with percussion has shaped the sound of popular music and aesthetic of groove. Brett covers the roots and traces of a social history of electronics in drum machines, rhythm boxes, and drum controllers. Brett's essay informs my research as it ties electronics, percussion, and popular music together in a cohesive manner. My research also covers the use of both triggering and sampling, so that ties into what Brett is talking about. Lastly, Peter Manning, in his book Electronics and Computer Music, creates an extensive account of the history of electronics and computer music from the beginning of the 21st century. Important topics for my research are the development of the digital audio workstation, also called DAW, laptop music, and the history and creation of Ableton Live and its use for live processing and performance. Now, we are in the second part of this presentation. I'm going to show you how to work through common issues found while playing electroacoustic music. These are also found in each work that I am playing. For the Ableton Live examples, I have created a demonstration track that will be used to show the different tools that I'm working with. So here are the 6 most common issues that I have identified when playing and working with electroacoustic music. The first issue is separating audio tracks for performer and audience. So Ableton Live can send separate audio tracks to multiple outputs. This is useful when a performer needs to hear audio cues, metronome, and/or specific parts within the piece. For most live performance situations, 4 output channels are needed, consisting of 2 separate stereo outputs. The master output routes through the speakers for the audience to hear, and then the cue output can be sent to headphones. I will demonstrate the audio routing, which again, routing is adjusting where the sound goes for each mix. So right now, I've got it set up so I have a click in my headphones and then the audience is just going to hear the tracks. I'm going to make this screen just a little bit larger so you guys can see it out there. So right now, the cue out is set to 3/4. That's my headphones. And then the master output is sent to 1/2. So the cue out contains the metronome. So now I'm going to go ahead and change the cue out to 1/2. So out there in the audience, now you're going to hear the metronome track that I hear, the separate mix. Another common issue that I'll work with is I will use a separate send for the headphones. So right now I have this custom send up here, and I can send whatever tracks I want to hear through that custom send. So rather than having the piano, the bass, I could just have whatever track I want to have in there. So that is also very useful. The next tool I use is equalization. Equalizing music is essential to achieving a well-balanced practice and performance mix. Some electroacoustic works are already mastered in balance, but due to the nature of acoustic differences in music halls, classrooms, and spaces, equalizing is important and should be considered for each unique performance situation and each piece. The first tool on the left picture is the compressor. The compressor is a device that affects the dynamic range of a signal by bringing down the level of the loudest part and making the loud and quiet parts closer together in volume. Next, we have EQ, which stands for equalizer. That's right here in the middle. It's called EQ8. EQ8 is a graphic equalizer featuring up to 8 parametric filters, useful for changing a sound's timbre. Parametric meaning affecting parameter, and that parameter in the situation is frequency and gain, or volume and pitch. In this example, I'm using 3 types of filters: a high-pass filter, which cuts low frequency, 2 bell curve filters, which boost the range of frequencies in the middle, and a low shelf filter, which cuts frequencies lower than a specified point. Before I demonstrate this, I'm just going to say that 2 things. Having an engineer is helpful, always. But a lot of times you don't have an engineer, but even just being able to know how to communicate with an engineer and talk about frequency and gain and different types of filtering is incredibly important. The next thing is be respectful to the composer and the composition. Not every work needs to be EQ'd or compressed, so performers should use your ears. You're the one playing this piece, you practiced it, but be respectful to the composition. I'm going to show the equalization with the next demo. So I'm going to turn off the compressor for right now, and I'm just going to show you the EQ, which is down here in the bottom. So I'm going to change this low-pass filter, which is number 1, and I'm just going to move it around so you can hear how the sound changes. Now, because I'm playing with a drum set, I want the electronics to have this low-end cut, so my bass drum pops through the track. Ideally, with EQ, every sound will have its place on the frequency spectrum and will be easy and clear to hear. That's the point of EQing. So again, I'm going to show you this compressor. In this instance, there's only piano and bass happening, so it's going to be a slight effect. But you're just going to hear some more of the bass grittiness coming through. So that's off. I'll turn it on one more time. So what's happening is the softest sound is getting louder and the loudest sound is getting softer. Oops. All right. This brings us to our next issue. The common practice of learning notes is more complicated when coordinating with electronic accompaniment. Playing with fixed media, audio, or MIDI samples doesn't usually allow for changing or altering the composed material. However, with Ableton Live, I will show the process of adjusting the composed material as a means to practice. The first method is lowering the global tempo. This can be done in Ableton Live without changing the pitch material, which is nice if you've memorized a section or are working with a melodic instrument. The second method is to alter and edit the fixed media to make practice loops. Lastly, you can use Ableton to record practice sessions and performances, which is a really excellent pedagogical tool. So I'm going to go ahead and show these elements. So I'm going to go ahead and imagine that this piece is written for metronome 150, and it's going to be fast. Now, in order to practice this, I'm going to slow the tempo down, and I'll go ahead and play along with it. So this is more of a practice tempo. Set it to 130. And as you can see, I'm setting this up in this left-hand top corner, and that is just a metronome. So I can also, if there's a section of the piece that I want to work on, I can take the audio and I can make a short practice loop in Ableton Live. As musicians, we call this woodshedding, where you take a part and you just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. So this is our session view. Session is a top-down view. I'm going to arrangement view, which is a side-scrolling left-to-right view, which you might see if you're recording audio. So I've got the same audio tracks. They look a little bit different because you're seeing the actual MIDI notes displayed. And I'm going to go ahead and make a short loop of just the beginning. And I've even set up a marker that says practice here. So I'm going to go ahead and play it, and then I'm going to play the drums to it. Now, I can confidently raise the tempo, play it faster, continuing practicing this small loop that I've created, or I can even move this loop around and practice a different section in the same manner. Now, I'm going to show you how I can record my practice session with Ableton Live. And right now, I'm just using a single microphone. So even if you just have one microphone and you want to get an accurate sound of how your balance sounds with the track, you can do that very easily. So I'm going to go ahead and play the first section that I played for you and record that. So here I go. Now we can hear back what I just recorded. So you can see what an excellent pedagogical tool this is, but also just being able to take the audio that you're working with and manipulate it so you can practice certain sections. So I wanted to illustrate this for you in this demonstration track, and keep in mind these elements when I go on to the actual pieces, because I use these same techniques and tools. We're going to have a very short 3-minute break. If you're online, please start thinking of questions and write them in the chat. All right, I'm going to continue back up. I'm set up. I've got my next piece loaded. So I'm going to continue on. We've reached part 3. For each composition, I will look at instrumentation, general performance notes. Then I'll show the notation used for the drum set and electronics where applicable. Then I'll identify the type of electronics used in the composition. I will list the challenges that I found in practice and performance and show how to resolve them with Ableton Live demonstrations. Each analysis will conclude with a full performance of the work. The first piece I'm going to discuss and play is Train Set, written by Elliot Britton. You can see an overhead view of the setup. The instrumentation for this track has kick drums, bongo, piccolo snare, deep snare, 2 graduated toms, ride, crash cymbals, triangle, elephant bells, which are similar to sleigh bells, and a tam-tam. As you can see, this percussion key is on the score, and I've included it here. Train Set uses standard drum set notation, except for some non-traditional elements, such as bongos and tam-tam. Special notations include open and closed hi-hat, choked cymbals, bell, edge of cymbal, rim clicks on the drums, and then there are some aleatoric sections of the piece that are interpreted with boxes with notation inside, where the performer chooses which box to play at a given time. There's also improvisatory sections in the piece, and the bottom picture here in this slide shows the notation for the electronics, which gives the performer a visual element to track along to with the traditional notation. Here is a picture of the score. The top line is the drum set, the performer, and the bottom line is the electronics. The electronics provided in train set consist of 2 fixed media tracks, one master track for the audience and another cue track for the performer. In Britton's performance diagram, he specifies the use of stage monitors. I only used headphones, and I will discuss why. I found the cue track provided by Britton was not sufficient and was a little bit ambiguous regarding timing with electronics and the notated drum set. So I'm going to discuss how I created new click tracks and audio cues. I also found that the track volume was a little bit inconsistent with some of the written dynamics, so I used a volume automation, which is a parameter on the volume that I set and change as the track plays. And lastly, I put a 5-second space with a fade-in on the track so I can play the first notes with the electronic, giving me just a little bit of time to cue the track and actually sit down at the drums. So here is an example of the performance diagram that Britton included with the piece. As you can see, the monitor speakers are shown as triangles to be pointed at the performer. So because there is a performance cue track and that has a metronome, the headphones must be worn regardless. So I eliminated the need for the monitors in my performance of this, and I am just doing a stereo output. So the audience has an output, and I have a separate output. I have organized the electronics into 4 separate tracks routed in varying ways. The first track contains the fixed media and is routed to the master 1-2 output. This is the audience track. The second is Britton's cue track with sections of metronome. This audio is routed to 3-4, my headphones. The third track is my own created cues. So in addition to more click tracks throughout the piece, I've also recorded vocal cues that provide direction for stick changes and sound descriptions like gongs, scrapes, cymbal mutes, etc. The final track is a recording made by the drummer who commissioned the piece, Ben Reimer. I use this as a reference aid. It's nice to have and to be able to hear someone else playing the track so I can reference another recording of it while I'm learning the piece. So it's just a learning aid. So I'm going to first show you these separate tracks in Ableton Live and how I work with them. So the first track I'm going to play for you is the fixed media track. This is the track this track is going through 1-2, and this is the track that you would hear while I play this. So I've set up, again, I've got a marker here, demo for presentation, and I even have a practice loop when I practice this piece, because this is a difficult section. Now, I'm going to play the cue track that Britton includes with the electronics. Again, and now I'm going to show you that same track, and I'm going to show you my cue track that I built in the program, and I'm going to go ahead and play it with the fixed media so you can hear how the metronomes line up with the electronics. And I'm going to play for you while I do this, so you can hear the different parts while I'm playing it. So you will hear the track as I hear it. Gong hit with cymbal, choke, open hit with gong, 6, run down the toms with a gong hit, or bass drum. Tom-tom roll slowing down to bongo. So anyways, you can hear how I've added vocal cues and additional metronome tracks. The next part that I brought up before, so I can see here in Ableton, I've set a 5-second delay, or not delay, but I've set 5 seconds of silence at the beginning of the piece, and that's simply so I can press play and have time to set up. So here it starts. I've also added a fade into the track, which is just nice so the track doesn't suddenly come in, so it fades in nicely. And then I'll show you I have a fade out as well at the end. Again, as I mentioned before, I'm using a volume automation. So that automation is this red line at the top, and the dots are the articulation of the automation. So during this piece, if I had a section where I've performed this and I played it for studio classes, and I hear feedback saying this part is always too loud, or you can't hear the drum set, or I need to hear more electronics, I can take notes of those sections and I can actually raise and lower the volume so that during the performance, the volume will lower on its own. So right now, just as a example, I'm going to show you that I'm going to lower the volume in the very beginning, and then the volume is going to raise. So we will just listen to that. The volume gets softer, and now the volume is going to come back up. As you can see, it's going up. So that's how I use volume automation within the piece. At this point, I'm going to play a run-through of Train Set, and I'm going to leave the screen up so you can track along. And again, just to remind you, the top is the fixed media. This third, it looks like the third track, but it's the second track. Track plus click, that's Britton's track he's included. And then I have my own click. So you can see where I've added in parts and added in additional clicks. So now I'm going to set this back up so the clicks are just going through 3/4, which is my headphones. And as the audience, you will hear 1 and 2. Thank you. We are now going to move on to the next piece. All right, extend. All right, here we go. Metamorphosis is a piece written for solo drum set with electronics. It's written by Federico Benchi. The instrumentation for Metamorphosis includes a kick drum, snare drum, large wooden plank, 2 cymbals, hi-hat, trigger pad, mallets, brushes, and sticks are also required. Metamorphosis consists of fixed media sections accompanied by drum set and live looping. There are 4 macro sections that are marked by live effect processing drum looping. The first loop captures the bass drum, which is affected with a resonator, giving the bass drum a pitch that matches the drones. The second records a wood slab affected with reverb and delay. The third loop are cymbals, which are being played with soft mallets. And in the last loop, it captures the snare drum played with brushes. Each loop reflects a part of the fixed media track. There is also an additional Ableton Live looper device, which is MIDI controlled by the performer. Rather than traditional notation or standard notation for the music, Benke writes a descriptive and poetic musical direction. The instructions may be interpreted in different ways as the descriptions are colorful and poetic. The performance notes serve as an instructive guide. Disorder morphs into order. The performer hears the tape piece and reacts to it. Performer and tape are two reactants that inevitably morph into a different new entity. Gestures are not hurried or impulsive, but pensive and executed. Emotions are measured. Sobriety over extroversion. Brahms over Liszt, Haydn over Mozart. Attacks are firm, deliberate, done consciously and intentionally, but restrained and unhurried. Rhythmic elements are plain, natural, succinct, and easy to apprehend. So that's from the notation instructions that I have for this piece, and there's about 8 pages that sort of describe how the piece should be played. Benke uses a visual diagram using markers and names on the master scenes in session view. Again, that's where samples and short clips play from top to bottom. I will show how I follow these during performance in Ableton. Because the electronics call for live processing with a looper device, I've also MIDI mapped the functions for the device of Ableton, as well as created automation for its parameters in arrangement view. Again, the arrangement is the right to left, more typical recording view. So here we're looking at the Ableton session view, where the samples play from top to bottom. And this is how the piece is played. The clips on the right provide a visual aid for the performer. Each scene, which is each little box, is labeled and corresponds to a section of the piece. These labels serve as a guide for the performer to observe musical elements, as well as provide a roadmap for upcoming climactic scenes: recording, looping, development, transition, decrescendos, codas, and the start and end of the piece. The 4 recording sessions show the macro sections of the piece, and those you can see are right in the middle. There are 2 types of looping. One built into the composition, which I just showed you. We're in the kind of very in the middle of the piece. These are loops in the session view, and they cannot be adjusted by the player. They are set in the composition. There is another device, though, however, built in Ableton that's another kind of looper and serves as a way for the performer to add intensity and build up climactic sections of the piece. MIDI mapping, which is where I hit commands on my MIDI device, which is the SPDX looper right here in the right-hand corner of the screen. That's what I have right here. So when I play a note on here, it triggers something in Ableton Live. And the mapping refers to the fact that I can control what button does what on Ableton Live. So it's like a pinpoint on a map. I hit something, and I decide what I want that to control. So in this instance, the MIDI mapping is controlling the looper. And by this looper, I mean the looper device. So I can set up and create short loops independently of the 4 loops happening within the piece. So this is, again, it creates another live processing element. And right now I have mapped the looping speed. I can move forward or backwards, and I can alter the loop state, whether it's recording, adding on to the recording, stopped, or just playing what I've recorded. So I'm going to go ahead and show you these elements, and then I'm going to perform the piece. Uh-oh. So like I said, you can see the visual mapping for this piece. So I have samples. These are the samples that get recorded. Start here. This is the button I press. And then this moves all the way down to the end. So basically, I run through this whole song from top to bottom. And I use the master names to see where I am in the track. Also, I have these 4 recording sections. So while I'm playing the piece, Watch as this little red light turns on, and that's when the 4 recordings are happening, one at a time. And again, like I said, these sort of represent the macro sections of the piece. Really quickly, I'm going to show you my MIDI controller and how I'm operating the loops. So here's the looper in Ableton Live down here on the left. And so right now the loop is playing in reverse. And as the piece plays, the looper is going to change whether it's happening forward, backward, and so on. All right, so pay attention to the different parts of the piece playing and my MIDI mapping of the controller as I play this piece. So now I'm going to perform for you Federico Bianchi's Metamorphosis. Thank you. Gonna go ahead and load the next piece. All right, here we go. The next piece I'm going to talk about is Baba Yaga. This is a piece that I wrote for this project. I wanted the piece to have a very minimal setup, and I wanted to have the addition of a MIDI controller. So the piece uses bass drum, snare drum, hi-hat, 2 cymbals, and the Roland SPDX. Baba Yaga is a collection of short samples. There are a total of 48 samples that are layered and played at various times throughout the piece. There are 2 movements, and each uses a different set of samples. The notation is standard drum set, and the samples are written on the treble staff above the drum set part. Each section of music is encased in a repeating rhythmic cell. Each cell is repeated and may be returned to at any point in the composition. The samples are notated on the treble staff from E4 to F5 and correspond to pads 1 through 9 on my MIDI controller. In this picture above, you can see the notation key for the drums and for the samples. So you can see I've only have 9 notes because there's 9 pads on this drum trigger. So the performance challenges. Because Baba Yaga is composed of many short samples and sections, I'm using a controller both as a MIDI instrument with Ableton Live's drum rack and as a MIDI device. I will show how I use the Roland as an instrument and as a device to control the composition. Additionally, the samples use live processing, which includes short modulation delay, which is like an echo effect, and an auto frequency filter, which cuts the middle frequency of the sound and slowly oscillates the intensity of the filter, giving the audio a moving quality similar to a tremolo. To activate each sample quickly and effectively, I am using the drum rack device in Ableton Live. The drum rack is in the picture. It's right here at the bottom. And the drum rack is a grid that represents 128 MIDI notes. It's an easy way to map and manipulate samples. The device works by dropping a short sample, instrument, and/or effect right on top of the grid. Then each part of that grid corresponds to a MIDI note. The MIDI controller acts like a piano, so whenever I play a specific note where I've dropped something on the grid, it activates that sample. So it works like a piano, except for I'm only able to play 9 notes at a time per kit on this device. So playing the MIDI note assigned to the pad will trigger a loaded sample. The drum rack allows the performer to access a large number of samples and customize how and where they trigger with the MIDI controller. So like I said, since I'm limited to 9 notes, I programmed different kits that have different MIDI notes. So when I want to go to a different part of the song, I just change my kit, which is just a button on the MIDI controller. It'd be like changing the octave on a MIDI keyboard. So the mappings in Baba Yaga are used to control and play the scenes in the master track. These scenes are composed of 6 different audio and MIDI samples, and these notes are mapped very low in the MIDI so that I'm not hitting them in the drum rack. And I'll go ahead and I'll show you this, everything I've talked about in Ableton Live, so you get an idea of what the MIDI mapping looks like on my controller, and then how the drum rack works as well. So first, I'm going to talk about the drum rack. So the drum rack I have mapped here at the bottom, and it is the bottom right of the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and play some of these samples and how they sound, and I'm just going to go ahead and just play them through. So if I have a sample and I want it to be in a specific part, I change the note on this pad and it corresponds to the note in my drum rack. And you can see here in the drum rack I have some notes that are not filled in. So you can see C2, D2, D sharp 2. So these are samples where I don't have anything, or they're parts of the grid. Like I said, I've also gone ahead and MIDI mapped. So what the MIDI mapping does is I can play a specific part of the drum kit, and it's going to trigger an actual sample I have in Ableton Live. So what's nice about MIDI mapping is that if I'm playing this piece, I can change the mappings very easily. So if I have a specific melody or something that I'm working with, I can change the order in which I play. So this first note, all I have to do is click where I want the MIDI mapping, and then hit the note, go out of MIDI mapping. Now I've got a note. An additional part of MIDI mapping that I like is that I can have a stop function. So I've actually built that into the composition and have notated the stop MIDI map as well. The effects happening, which I talked about, this is the auto filter, and I'll go back and I'll turn this off and on so you can hear the difference. So it's more of a flat sound versus gives it sort of this envelope sound. And then you can hear the echo in the track. So those are some live processing elements. All right, I'm going to go ahead and play for you Baba Yaga. And this is the world premiere performance of this piece. So you're lucky to hear the first time. Thank you. All right, I'm going to be talking about the last piece, and then we'll have a short break after I talk about it, and I'm going to invite up another performer. So the next piece I'm going to play is called Woven. Hold on one second. Woven is a piece for 2 performers, each with a drum set and triggered MIDI device. It's composed by Greg Harrison. The instrumentation includes kick drum, snare drum, 2 graduated toms, 2 cymbals, a hi-hat, and a trigger pad. The notation is standard drum set with the addition of a cymbal for the trigger pad. The music is organized in sections of repeats, and each containing 1 bar of musical passage with a numbered figure listed above, which corresponds to a looped electronic section. At the end of each phrase, the trigger hit is notated with a star. This note is played on an external drum trigger pad and is used to advance the pattern to the next section, or a scene in Ableton. Here's what the music looks like. So you can see each repeating section, and you can see the star to advance the track. Each player plays these repeating sections, and both players begin and end the piece together. But each player may take these repeats variable lengths of time, advancing the musical selections at their discretion. Harrison encourages each player to move at different speeds through the parts in the composition, creating rhythmic dissonance. The electronics for Woven use an Ableton Live file and CliffX, a Max MSP program. The Ableton Live file uses MIDI for sounds and instruments. Each electronic part corresponds with an acoustic sound, making the electronics and drum sound in unison, and gives the piece a unique melodic and rhythmic texture. CliffX is a Max program that enables Live for 2 performers to independently control Ableton Live. Whereas usually only 1 master session scene can play, CliffX allows there to be 2 independent controllers controlling different master sections. And again, this happens in the session view, which is where the scenes go down in a horizontal line. Woven uses MIDI mapping to advance the sections. Each player has to hit the trigger on the last quarter note of each repeat. Both are listening to a metronome routed through headphones. Because both players need to trigger MIDI mapped notes, 2 separate MIDI pads are required. I will show how the mapping facilitates both players as well as some navigating tools for rehearsing. I also had to assign some new instruments using Ableton for certain sections. Lastly, there's MIDI information for each drum part without an instrument assigned to the track. I believe Harrison used the MIDI to notate the drum parts, but I found that using an Ableton Live drum kit, I could practice with both drum parts. So as the solo performer, I could practice with the MIDI drum set part of the other player without actually having to have both people there. Since each player only needs MIDI map to MIDI map 1 note to advance the sections, the SPDX sampler works well. So the second player can connect the external pad, enabling the appropriate distance. So the other pad is over there, but it's connected to this same MIDI controller. Also mapped are an array of commands for rehearsing and performance. Some of these commands include setting a standard volume for each player, triggering sections, turning the speakers on, activating the record button to document a performance, toggling the metronome on and off, and a master scene launch which controls both player parts. I also have a stop function. I use the stop function all the time. So again, that's something that's MIDI mapped. I can hit this, and it allows me to control the program without actually having to be on the computer. Woven is composed solely of MIDI information. When I first received the piece from Harrison, most of the MIDI instruments were found in Ableton, but some of the instruments were from third-party companies. After talking to Harrison, he encouraged me to find some new software instruments for unique performance. I ended up changing some of the synths, as well as altering the equalization, reverb, panning, and delay for my performance. Another adjustment I made is hard panning each player's electronics so they match the acoustic sound direction to the audience. I will also show in Ableton how I assign the preset 808 drum set to the track to player 2 part so I can rehearse both drum parts with one player. So I'm going to show you these elements in Ableton Live. So first I'm just going to play for you a little bit of the MIDI mapping. So these parts play in a horizontal manner. So we are in session view, so these parts will just play down. So I will go ahead and play along with the track. And right now I have it set up so as the audience, you're going to hear the metronome. So you're going to hear the exact same thing I hear. And now if I want to go back and rehearse a section, I hit this note, and this, now I have some different controls. I can go up, I can go down. So I can rehearse different sections of the piece. Again, if I have something, I'm playing something, and I need to stop, I can stop the composition. And I can do this while I'm rehearsing or while I'm working on this on my own. I'm also going to show you just an example of how a different instrument can sort of change the sound of the entire piece. So I've taken a couple of the sounds and I've changed them. Because like I said, when I first got this, some of the instruments I had to actually change. So I'll go ahead and play a section for you with some different sounds. So this is one sound, and then I'm going to go back to a different sound. I'm going to go on to one more section. Versus the same exact information on MIDI, but with different instruments. So I'm showing you this just to show you that with Ableton, you can change the sounds around without actually changing the composition. And that's something that the composer actually welcomes in this piece. Lastly, I'm just going to show you what it sounds like when I have the second player's part playing the drum set that I assigned in Ableton Live. So here is player 2, and here's this drum set part. So I simply added an 808 drum kit to this, and I'll just go ahead and solo it so you can hear it. Something else soloed. So what I can do is I can practice along to this same part. Now, since we are going to play this piece for you, I'm not going to go ahead and practice it with the 808 drum kit because we're going to have a live drum set player here. But I'm just saying that it is a nice way that you can practice with another person without actually having to have the other person. And it's the exact same part that Harrison wrote. So we are going to take a short 3-minute break while Zach White comes up and we get this next piece set up. It's fine. We'll leave it on. Are you, is it muted?
Yeah.
Cool, thanks. Do not like that. Just gonna do a quick sound check and just make sure we have audio going on. Carson, is the audio back on? Yep. Oh. Let's turn this on. Whoops. There we go. We've got sound. All right, we're going to continue with a performance of Woven, featuring Zach White as the second player. Thank you. Closing statements. With the use of Ableton Live, I've demonstrated how more productive practice and better informed performances can be achieved through the knowledge of routing audio for performance and audience separately, editing audio, equalizing audio, MIDI mapping, MIDI controllers playing samples, making custom click and audio cue tracks, setting up practice routines, loops, and changing the tempo without altering the pitch, and adjusting volume and effect through automation, and lastly, live processing. Thank you for listening. I want to give a big thanks to Dr. Palter and the rest of my committee who have helped guide me through this whole process, and I hope you have enjoyed this lecture recital out there in the internet. So now I will answer questions. I'm going to start with in-person questions, and then I will move on to online questions. Are there any questions in the audience?
Sure, there are. I'll get started here. I think you've shown pretty effectively what the capabilities are with Ableton with respect to how you are utilizing it and the means in which you're using it to realize these pieces. I guess it's sort of a two-part question that's related. One is, the first part being, are there areas that you felt it really wasn't reconciling some of the things, Ableton, I mean, wasn't reconciling the sorts of things that you were needing and hoping it could? And I guess the other part of that would be, I think we're at Ableton 11.0 right now, right? So what do you think like Ableton 22.0 might look like? Like, where is this going? And what can we expect if you had to,
Yeah,
put
well,
some money on it?
sure. I mean, so starting with your first question, I think as I play electroacoustic works and got into this, I just found that using Ableton was easier to run the audio and run the basic thing is just audio routing. So having a different sound through headphones than you have in the audience. So that's where I started because it was really easy to do that. And then I started practicing with the program and basically just setting up more and more and sort of creating it to something that I use as like a tool that works really well for me. So, I mean, what's nice about this kind of program is that it's really customizable for each performer. So I think I outlined a lot of the basic things that the program can do, but different performers do completely different things with the program. And I've seen people work with Ableton Live in amazing ways that I can't even explain. So I think it's hard to say where the program is going because on one hand, the program actually hasn't changed that much. It's just been a very wide open format for running audio in MIDI in a live situation. So
is it safe to say that up to this point you have not encountered a situation that you haven't been able to reconcile with Ableton, or perhaps a situation where you didn't think you were able to use Ableton to reconcile something?
yeah, I mean, yes, for my own purposes, there has been some specific places where like a composer has written a Max MSP program, but now that I have used Ableton, I found that I can actually make the same file in Ableton and run it easier. So I do actually use Ableton to reconcile these issues, even when a composer is writing in another piece. So, yeah.
And so where do you think it's, I guess, hard to say that where it's going? I mean, are people using it for, I guess, video processing and
Yeah,
kinds of things outside of audio effects, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so Ableton does do some very basic video processing. I could see the program working more with video, so you could be running your live video, your live audio all at the same time. And again, that's something more in line with Max MSP, where you can sort of write all these different parameters for the program. But because Max MSP works in Ableton Live as well, many people prefer Ableton Live because it's so easy to run these basic features that you come across when you're playing electroacoustic music that I discussed here. But as far as what the future of the program looks like, I think just more live capability, and like you said, being able to run lights and audio and video, and maybe even coordinate like online live concert streaming and stuff like that, like actual tools that you would make as a performer, maybe, you know, actually performing for not a live audience, but like a live stream.
Yeah, I mean, I've only worked with, I guess, Ableton Live 9.0, 10.0, and now I guess 11.0, which I don't have yet. But I haven't noticed any giant leaps in, like, oh, now all of a sudden it can do this, which it couldn't do before. So I'm wondering, you know, I guess that's what I'm asking is you know, what happens when we leap ahead 10 versions of Ableton?
Yeah.
Are we going to see something? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Ableton, it's seen more as a live processing and live performance instrument versus a recording program. But I know that at least the latest version of Ableton is gearing toward more of a recording program. So it has additional features that deal with live recording. So being able to do multiple takes and things like that. So, you know, I think as a company, they listen to what people are trying to do with it, and I think they expand based on that. So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got one. Have you, I mean, in your experience using Ableton Live and playing electroacoustic works, have you started to see like a standardization of like, I guess, a notated, like your notated tape tracks, for example, something you're playing along to with fixed media or something that you're supposed to trigger yourself? Have you seen composers start to standardize the way that they do that in the music that you're reading?
What I can say to that, it seems that if you have a composition and they're specifically using Ableton Live, with any sort of samples, it uses the session view, which is sort of the top-down view where you play triggered samples. So anything with triggering tends to use that view, like Woven and Baba Yaga, and even Metamorphosis used that so I could track what's going on at a given time, versus, you know, something like a fixed media piece or an older piece. If I were playing something like Temescal, which is a maraca solo, that's something where I would just put that into the arrangement view and just be able to kind of watch it go by. But I guess a trend that I've seen is that people have been composing in the session view more with electroacoustic works. You know, I think there's still a lot more works coming, and because these programs are gaining in popularity, more and more people are doing what they, you know, think the program does best, and I think that's lending itself into different ways. So I haven't seen any real standardization yet, though, because I think, like you said, you know, this program has only been around since 2001, and it could not do as much as it does now. But as it becomes more of a standard tool just for just really basic audio editing and audio routing, it makes it a really easy choice, I think, for composers to use. And then the fact that it has been made to play live in like this situation and be reliable. So
I guess I meant more in the context of written notation, like what you'd see on sheet music, for example. That's more of where I was going for, but I totally understand what you're
yeah, sorry. As far as written notation, I mean, I've seen sort of the standardization of drum set, but nothing as far as like triggering. For Baba Yaga, I hadn't seen anything like my notation for it, which again, I sort of wrote the samples on a grand staff. It made sense to me because, you know, I read Western music, so I could, you know, and as a percussionist, we constantly have to deal with different ways and different notations. So that was an easy way for me that I have seen in other pieces, but I haven't seen in other electroacoustic pieces. So, awesome. I've got some questions here too that I can
Okay.
kind of read.
Do you have any from your committee?
Um,
I just want to make sure that they're covered.
Zach, do you want to just check and see if there's some committee questions? And I'm just going to go through some of these.
Go ahead.
All right, so I believe this is from Marcus. Question. Between composers that compose for performers and composers that compose as performers, which is more common? So I think Marcus is referring to Osberger's dissertation. And definitively, it's hard to say because there's tons of composers that compose with Ableton Live. I'll say that I think there's going to be more performers as composers because similar to myself, I've found that using Ableton Live, I've been able to compose, and it's allowed me to share my compositions in a way where I hadn't found something like this before. So I think, and I can speak for Zach also, uses Ableton Live to compose. So we're performers that, I think as drummers and percussionists, we know the ins and outs of the instrument so well, and we want to compose electroacoustic works. And so Ableton has been a nice way for percussionists to compose. Another question from Allison Doak. How does it feel being, how does it feel being so fresh? I'll read these questions before I answer them.
Yeah.
It feels good. Tayon Fraser. Question. You mentioned Ableton Live as being a great pedagogical tool. How would you apply Ableton Live in an educational context, such as in the U of A percussion studio? Wow, great question, Tayon. So I would, I think the first thing is using it to record yourself. And even if you're not playing electroacoustic work, you can have Ableton to record, to be able to use as a metronome, and to set up practice samples of pieces for yourself. So whether you're playing with other people, or say you're recording something for a large ensemble, you could have the actual music in Ableton, and you could practice along with it, and then again, you can record yourself. I think the recording capabilities are where I would use it in a pedagogical sense. And then, playing electroacoustic pieces, I think is something that more and more performers have to do. And I think this is a great program for being able to run anything from very simple works to very complex works. So that's that. Zach, did you find any questions?
None from the committee.
Okay. I've got a question from Michael Braun. Question: do you find playing with a track with perfect time liberating, or do you find it a hindrance? How do you approach time differently while playing along with electronics? It's a great question. I find that it can be more liberating having a click to play with. It's something that you have to get used to, but once you are used to having that click, it's very reliable, it's always there, and you can always trust that it's on time. So you can, or I guess personally, I try to figure out where my beats align in the music and with the electronics, and I can play slightly ahead of the beat, slightly behind the beat, so I like playing around with the click track. And then approaching time in electronics, it depends on the piece. I am trying to write and compose more pieces that don't use a click track because I like the idea of using more live processing elements to have just a more kind of spontaneous sound without that click track. So I appreciate both the click track for its reliability, but I also want to champion and compose and encourage the composition of more works that don't use a click track and that use more sampled based or triggering based media. Alyssa Pritchard asks, do you have to consider sound delay in the electronic track when performing these pieces? Great question, Alyssa. Yes, you do. As with any acoustic sound, you have to be conscious of where this sound is coming out of. So that's the speakers, and then your live sound. So ideally, the speakers and your acoustic instrument are going to be balanced as far as where people hear them. So that's true with any instrument. As far as Ableton Live, you have, or in any sort of recording program, you have what's called latency. And latency is just how long it takes for something electronic to happen. So if I hit a MIDI note, how long does it take for that trigger to sound acoustically for the audience. So basically what you have to do is you have to have the lowest latency you can possibly have. So basically I think my latency right now is maybe 11 milliseconds. So that seems to be pretty good.
Can you change that? Like, sorry to interrupt, but why not set it at 0?
So the latency deals with how many samples are processed at a certain time. So the lower the latency, the faster the samples are processed, and so the less samples your computer can actually handle. So if you're playing a piece with tons of samples, it's going to be really taxing on the computer to run all those samples, and you'll start getting kind of choppy digital sounds. Versus if you're playing a piece with few samples and not a lot of processing, you can turn the latency pretty much down as far as it'll go. So I got a question from Eric Hutchins. Question: do you use plug-in effects on either the live audio or fixed media or both to tie in the two sources together sonically? I'm thinking reverb and delay mainly. So to answer that question, Eric, yes, I do. To add sort of a natural sound, I use reverb on the electronics. Because we're in a hall, we have natural reverb, so I went ahead and I lowered that reverb sound. And I felt like the drums, because I'm in a hall, but if I was in a classroom or outside, I would definitely add reverb to the drum mix and the electronics, and also just to make it so they sound like they're coming from the same place, which would be sort of a sound system. All right. Question: is there a narrative thread in this piece based on the Slavic folklore tales of Baba Yaga? That is a question from Brian Ransom. So he's asking about my piece, and I guess I was more attracted to sort of the visual image of Baba Yaga, especially she has a house that is built on chicken legs, and she is sort of this Slavic witch. And for me, I sort of equated having this sampler playing all these samples and these different parts of the piece as sort of like playing these sort of magic spells. So it equates in a very basic way to the kind of folklore tale, but I wouldn't say that extensively. It was just something that I was attracted to in the image and just the idea of something magic happening, so electroacoustic. I have another question from Marcus. Question: if you don't prefer to use the 808 kit when playing by yourself for woven, what alternatives would be suitable? Marcus, to answer that question, I do find the 808 suitable. It's something that I can use just simply to practice with, to hear what the other drum part sounds like. And again, I can even do that on my own drum part, just to hear how the notation reads. If I wanted something that was more realistic, I could easily have another drum kit in Ableton Live used to play those same triggers. But for me, since I'm just trying to get a sound in my head of the other part, but I don't want it to take away from the sound of Zach. So again, I would say this is more of a learning aid than something that I would put, a lot of time into finding the perfect kit for. All right. Zach, did you see any more questions? I think two at the bottom. Can I not see them? For some reason, I can't see them.
The question, in Baba Yaga, you defined a digital stop action in the notation. How do you think the shift toward digital will affect musical semiotics?
That's an excellent question. So as far as semiotics, I think of symbols, and I think it really depends on whether you want to describe sounds in a visual format is something that like look like the sound, or if you're just referring to the symbolism like a note refers to a specific pitch. So for me, and when I wrote Baba Yaga, the stop is just one of the 9 pitches. So it's not written any different than any of the other pitches. And I did that just to remain kind of consistent. I think consistency is the key with notation. So whatever system you use, I think it's good to use that system. I mean, I might, like Greg Harrison uses the sort of star to trigger the next sample. So whatever works simply and effectively, I think, is the best solution for the sort of semiotic notation.
Got one more. This one's coming from Griffin Law. Do you see electroacoustic composition finding its way into primary curriculum in the next 5 to 10 years? For instance, when do you expect to see these skills become required at an undergraduate level?
Well, I would say currently, I'm seeing this start happening in high schools, where high schools are having electroacoustic courses and even Ableton Live courses. I know at least 2 programs in the Tucson area that have already integrated this. So as far as with percussion, it's really hard to say. I think percussion is already squeezed by so many different instruments. Are you a marimba player? Do you play multi-percussion? You know, I think do you play electroacoustic percussion is going to come out of this, but it's not going to take away from the fundamentals of playing the snare drum and learning how to read notes. I think it's just going to be something that is going to kind of evolve naturally, and if you have a interest in playing electroacoustic works, you know, hopefully at a high school or college level, there's going to be courses that supplement that learning, so you can already have a head start with playing these kinds of pieces.
I just want to piggyback on that. I guess I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how important it is, just in general, for instrumentalists to be able to use a program like Ableton, irregardless of whether or not they want to be electroacoustic composers or performers. Like, in other words, how can you utilize this program in just day-to-day life as an acoustic instrumentalist, whatever the instrument is that you play?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, being able to use it in the simplest way, like as a metronome and to record yourself, is so important. And then if you are doing any sort of recordings for auditions, or, you know, I think using it as a recording tool and being able to go in and add, you know, very basic EQing that is not actually editing, but it just makes the mix sound better. So I think as like any musician, we have to do audition takes, we have to send auditions, and more increasingly, we have to have sort of an online presence of material. So Ableton very easily helps you accomplish that just by being able to render audio, put it on the internet, combine it with video, and just give you a very basic grasp on, you know, very easy audio editing that I think audio editing and music production will be more kind of expected things as music students, because it's the way that I think education is going. It's turning more into an online format. I mean, even right now, I'm presenting for a pretty large audience, and most of those people are online. So
let me follow up my question with another question then.
Yes.
So, seeing as there's only 2 of us here, I can hog the floor, I guess. So what would you equate, so we started this Ableton class here a couple years ago now. You were like the first official. I started it up. You were the first one to come next to teach this class. We now have Zach, the 3 of us in the room here that are dealing with this. Why do you think, and maybe this is an unfair or a pointed question, why do you think there aren't more people signed up for a class like this? I'm not saying that specific class, but why do you think more instrumentalists, acoustic instrumentalists, aren't or don't see the benefit of this in a way that 40, 50, 60 people aren't enrolled in the class, or in any class like this.
Yeah, I think if it comes down to maybe marketing, like finding out what other students want, other music students. So again, I think coming at it from like, learn how to, after you take this course, you're gonna have 5 different audition takes that you can then send to universities or use as audition material for, different orchestras and stuff. So I think if we were sort of to market it in a way that kind of focused more on the recording side of Ableton, so recording and producing in that aspect, I think I could see the program become more popular for, traditional musicians.
I agree.
All right.
Any other?
Well,
I think we're good.
if you stuck around, thank you so much for listening, and have a great evening.